in thick, silent blankets over the manicured lawns of Greenwich, Connecticut, turning the sprawling Sullivan estate into a scene that belonged on a vintage holiday postcard. Inside the colonial-style mansion, the warmth of a crackling fire in the hearth fought against the bitter chill rattling the window panes. Martha Sullivan stood in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour as she meticulously basted a 20-pound turkey. The aroma of rosemary, sage, and roasted butter filled the house, a scent she had associated with safety and family for over 40 years. Martha was 68, her hair a soft silver that caught the light of the overhead chandelier, and her eyes, though weary, still held a sparkle of hope. This was the first Christmas since she had officially retired from the public eye, and she wanted everything to be perfect. She wanted her children to feel the same magic they had felt when their father, the late real estate titan Arthur Sullivan, was still alive to lead the toast at the head of the mahogany table. Arthur had built this house, and Martha had turned it into a home. Every crown moulding, every piece of imported Italian marble, and every hand-stitched curtain represented a brick in the fortress of their legacy. Since Arthur's passing 5 years ago, the house had felt echoing and vast, but Martha never complained. She took pride in maintaining the Sullivan standard, keeping the gardens pristine and the silver polished, waiting for the moments when her son, David, and her daughter Sarah would return from their busy lives in the city. To Martha, this house was not an asset. It was a museum of their shared history. She could look at the scratch on the floor in the foyer and remember exactly where David had dropped his trophy after his first varsity win, or the stain on the rug in the library where Sarah had spilled ink while writing her college applications. David arrived first, his black SUV crunching over the fresh powder in the driveway. He was 42 now, a man who wore his ambition like a tailored suit that was slightly too tight. He stepped into the foyer, shaking the snow off his designer coat, but he didn't offer his mother a hug. Instead, he checked his gold watch, his eyes darting around the room as if he were performing a mental inventory. Close behind him was his wife, Jessica, a woman whose beauty was as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. Jessica didn't care for the smell of roasting turkey. She complained immediately about the humidity in the air affecting her blowout. Sarah, Martha's 38-year-old daughter, followed 10 minutes later, clutching her phone as if it were an oxygen mask. Sarah was a socialite who lived for the flash of a camera and the validation of followers she would never meet. She swept into the house with a flurry of silk and perfume, barely glancing at the hand-decorated tree Martha had spent 3 days perfecting. The dinner started with a tension that Martha tried to ignore. She served the soup, the fine crystal clinking against the silver, her heart swelling with a bittersweet joy at seeing her children together. She talked about the local charity drive and the new roses she planned to plant in the spring, but the conversation at the table was one-sided. David and Sarah spoke over her, discussing the volatile market in New York and the escalating costs of their lifestyles. Jessica sat in silence, her eyes tracking the movement of Martha's hands, a faint, predatory smirk playing on her lips. Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. She tried to tell a story about their father, a memory of a Christmas in Aspen when the kids were small, but David cut her off mid-sentence. "Mom, we didn't come here to talk about the past," David said, his voice dropping into a professional tone that he usually reserved for boardrooms. He set his wineglass down with a definitive click. "We need to talk about the future. The Sullivan future." Martha froze, a spoonful of mashed potatoes halfway to her plate. "The future? Well, dear, I was just saying I think we should renovate the guest wing next summer. It would be lovely for when the grandchildren come to stay." Sarah let out a sharp, jagged laugh that grated against Martha's ears. "Grandchildren? Mum, we can barely afford the nannies we have now, and you're talking about guest wings." Do you have any idea what the property taxes on this place are? $200,000 a year. $200,000 just so you can sit in a museum and talk to ghosts. Martha's hand trembled. The taxes are high, yes, but your father left plenty in the trust. I've been careful, Sarah. I've managed the accounts exactly as Robert Vance advised. Robert Vance is an old man with old ideas, David snapped. He leaned forward, the candlelight casting long, distorted shadows across his face. We've had an independent audit done, Mum. Jessica and I spent the last 3 months looking into the Sullivan estate. You're draining the family's liquidity. You're sitting on a gold mine while Sarah and I are out there in the real world, fighting to keep our heads above water. This house is an anchor, and it's dragging us all down. It's not just an anchor, David. It's a moocher's paradise, Jessica added, her voice dripping with a calculated cruelty. She looked Martha directly in the eye. You've lived in this house for free for 5 years, Martha. You consume utilities. You employ a grounds crew. You spend thousands on groceries that you don't even finish. You're a moocher on your own children's inheritance. You're eating away at the capital that belongs to David and Sarah. The word moocher hit Martha like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face, her heart hammering against her ribs. I helped your father build every cent of this fortune. I raised you in this house. How can you call me a moocher? I am your mother. Being a mother doesn't give you the right to be a financial burden, Sarah said, tapping her manicured nails against the table. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a glossy, thick brochure, sliding it across the mahogany surface toward Martha. We've already made the arrangements. We didn't want to ruin Christmas. But honestly, the timing is perfect. The market is peaking, and we have a buyer for the Greenwich property who is willing to pay $12 million cash if we close by the end of the month. Martha looked down at the brochure. In bold gold lettering, it read, Evergreen Manor, a new chapter in senior living. The images showed sterile rooms with beige walls and elderly people sitting in plastic chairs, staring blankly at a television. It was a nursing home, a cold, distant facility 3 towns away, known for its efficiency and its lack of soul. You want to put me in a home? Martha whispered, her voice cracking. You want to sell your father's house? The house he built for us? It's for your own good, Mum, David said, his voice devoid of any warmth. You're getting older. You're forgetful. You left the stove on last month. Don't think we didn't hear about that from the housekeeper. Evergreen Manor has 24-hour medical staff. You'll be safe there, and the proceeds from the sale of this house will go toward clearing the bridge loans Sarah and I took out for our ventures. It's a win-win. I am not forgetful, Martha said, her voice rising with a desperate strength. The stove was an accident, a single moment of distraction. I am healthy. I am capable. I will not leave my home. I will not let you sell this history for a bridge loan. You don't have a choice, Sarah said, her eyes flashing with a cold, terrifying triumph. She reached into the same handbag and pulled out a second set of documents, legal papers with a government seal. David and I met with a judge last week. We've been granted a temporary emergency conservatorship over your affairs. We told him about the incidents, Mum. The stove, the way you've been hoarding assets, the psychological instability you've shown since Dad died. The court agreed that you are no longer fit to manage the Sullivan estate. Martha looked at the papers, her vision blurring as tears finally began to spill. The incidents were fabrications, twisted versions of reality. The stove was a minor slip, but they had framed it as a sign of dementia. Her refusal to give David more money for his failing tech startup had been framed as financial hoarding. Every act of autonomy she had shown had been weaponized against her. How could you? Martha sobbed, her head falling into her hands. I gave you everything. I spent 40 years of my life making sure you never wanted for anything. I stood by you when David failed his first bar exam. And I paid for Sarah's 3 weddings. I am not a moocher. I am the woman who gave you the very life you are using to destroy me. Don't get emotional, Martha. It's unsightly, Jessica said, standing up and smoothed her silk dress. The car will be here in 1 hour. We've already had a professional crew come in while you were at church this morning to pack your essentials. Your trunk is in the hallway. Everything else in this house will be catalogued and auctioned by the end of the week. You have 21 days to settle into Evergreen before the new owners take possession. 21 days? Martha looked up, her face a mask of agony. You're giving me 21 days to say goodbye to my life? On Christmas Eve? Consider it a fresh start, David said, standing up to join his wife. He didn't look at the turkey he hadn't touched. He didn't look at the ornaments Martha had carefully hung. Sarah and I have lives to live, Mum. We can't be held back by your sentimental attachment to a pile of bricks. The world moves on. You should too. For the next 60 minutes, Martha moved through the house like a ghost in her own haunting. She saw the empty spaces on the walls where her favourite paintings had already been taken down and wrapped in bubble wrap. She saw the heavy wooden trunk in the foyer, filled with a few changes of clothes, a couple of family photos, and her medication. The house felt cold now, the fire in the hearth dying down to embers that no one bothered to stoke. David and Sarah stood in the living room, drinking expensive scotch and laughing about a trip to the Hamptons they were planning with the sale money. They didn't even offer to help her with her coat. The sound of a car horn honking outside signaled the arrival of the taxi. It wasn't a limousine or a town car. It was a yellow cab, a stark and humiliating contrast to the luxury of the Greenwich driveway. Martha picked up her purse, her fingers brushing against a small, velvet-lined box she had kept in her pocket. A gift she had intended for David, a pair of his father's gold cufflinks. She left the box on the foyer table, a silent testament to a love that was no longer recognized. "Goodbye, Martha," Jessica said, her voice ringing out through the empty hallway. "Don't worry about the house. We'll make sure it goes to someone who actually appreciates its market value." David and Sarah didn't even say goodbye. They were already looking at blueprints on David's iPad, debating whether to tear down the rose garden to put in a lap pool for the resale value. Martha stepped out into the biting wind, her thin coat offering little protection against the Connecticut winter. She climbed into the back of the taxi, the vinyl seat cold against her legs. As the driver pulled away, she pressed her face against the window, watching the Sullivan mansion shrink into the distance. The lights she had carefully hung flickered one last time before a shadow passed over the window, David closing the heavy velvet drapes on her life. Martha sat in the back of the cab, the hum of the engine a low, mournful drone. She looked at the driver, a middle-aged man who didn't know he was carrying the broken remains of a Greenwich dynasty. She thought about the chicken she had spent all day roasting, now sitting cold on the table, a feast for children who had no appetite for their mother's heart. She thought about Arthur, and for the first time since his death, she was glad he wasn't here to see this. He would have been devastated. But Martha felt something else beginning to stir beneath the layers of her grief. It wasn't the warmth of the turkey or the glow of the fire. It was a cold, hard ember of realization. She had spent 40 years being the heart of the Sullivan family, but David and Sarah only cared about the pulse of the Sullivan bank account. They saw her as a moocher, an old woman who was eating their future. They wanted her in a home, tucked away where she wouldn't cost them a cent of their precious liquidity. They thought they had won because they had the papers and the gold watches and the youth. They thought 21 days was enough time to erase a woman like Martha Sullivan. But as the taxi turned onto the main road, heading toward the drab, beige gates of Evergreen Manor, Martha's hand went to the hidden pocket in her handbag. She felt the cool, rectangular edge of a small black ledger she had taken from the safe before they could catalogue it. It wasn't a ledger of household expenses. It was the private record of the Sullivan Real Estate Trust, the one part of the estate that David and Sarah, in their arrogant haste, had never truly understood. They thought they knew the extent of their father's wealth. They thought they were entitled to every penny. But Arthur Sullivan was a man of secrets, and he had left the most important one with the person he trusted most. Martha looked out at the dark trees whizzing by, her tears drying into salt-streaked lines on her cheeks. Her psychological pain was vast, a canyon of betrayal that felt as though it might swallow her whole. But as she gripped the ledger, a new thought began to form. They had given her 21 days to find another place. They had given her 21 days to accept her fate as a forgotten relic in a nursing home. They didn't realize that in 21 days, a woman who has lost everything has nothing left to fear, and a woman with nothing left to fear is the most dangerous person in Greenwich. The gates of Evergreen Manor creaked open, revealing a building that looked more like a hospital than a home. The fluorescent lights inside flickered, casting a sickly green glow over the reception area. Martha stepped out of the cab, her feet crunching on the frozen gravel. She didn't look back at the life she had left behind. She looked forward at the beige walls of her prison, and she whispered a promise to the silent Connecticut night. "You called me a moocher," she said, her voice barely a breath. "You said I was eating your future. Well, my darlings, you're about to find out just how expensive a mother's love can really be." Martha walked through the automatic doors, the cold air following her in. She checked into the facility under the watchful, pitying eyes of the night nurse. She was led to a small, cramped room with a single window that overlooked a parking lot. It was a far cry from the velvet curtains and marble floors of her mansion, but Martha didn't complain. Bar sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the sound of a distant, hacking cough echoing from the hallway. Bar opened the black ledger, the pages filled with Arthur's precise, cramped handwriting. Bar began to read, her mind shifting from the role of the grieving mother to the role of the Sullivan matriarch. The betrayal was cruel. The pain was deep. But Martha Sullivan was not finished. She was merely beginning her 21-day countdown, and by the time the snow melted and the new year arrived, David and Sarah would learn that the most devastating injustices are the ones that come home to roost. Martha looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. Christmas had officially arrived. She closed the ledger, laid her head on the thin, scratchy pillow, and closed her eyes. She didn't dream of sugar plums or holiday magic. She dreamed of a cold, calculated justice that would restore her dignity and strip her children of the very arrogance they had used to break her heart. The first day of her 21-day sentence had begun, and Martha Sullivan was ready to make every second count. The silence of Evergreen Manor was not the peaceful quiet of a home, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a waiting room for the end of life. Martha Sullivan sat by the single window of her room, watching the grey slush of late December melt into the mud of a new year that felt more like a sentence than a beginning. The room smelled of industrial-grade lavender and the faint metallic tang of old radiator steam. Her bed was narrow, the sheets thin enough to see the blue veins in her hands, and the walls were a shade of beige that seemed designed to drain the colour from one's soul. For the first few days, Martha did not move much. She did not eat the flavourless porridge served on plastic trays, nor did she join the other residents in the common room, where a television blared game shows at a volume intended for the stone deaf. She was a woman in mourning, But she was not mourning the death of her husband anymore. She was mourning the death of the children she thought she had raised. She spent hours staring at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror above the sink. She looked for traces of David's jawline or Sarah's high cheekbones in her own face, trying to understand how the blood that flowed through her heart had become so toxic in theirs. She remembered David as a toddler, clutching her skirt and crying whenever she left the room for a moment. She remembered Sarah at 6, wearing Martha's oversized pearls and promising to never leave her side. Those memories felt like lies now, clever deceptions practiced by children who were born with a hunger for gold that no amount of motherly love could ever satisfy. The psychological weight of their betrayal was a physical ache in her chest, a constant pressure that made every breath feel like an effort. She felt discarded, like a piece of furniture that had gone out of style, moved to the basement to gather dust until the executors of the estate decided it was time for a bonfire. But every night, when the night nurse completed the final rounds and the facility settled into an uneasy sleep, Martha reached under her thin mattress. She pulled out the small black ledger, the leather cover worn smooth by Arthur's hands. This was her lifeline. As she turned the pages, lit only by the pale glow of a street lamp from the parking lot, the fog of her grief began to lift, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Arthur had been a man of meticulous detail, a man who saw the world in grids of numbers and legal clauses. He had known that David was weak and that Sarah was vain. He had seen the way they looked at the Sullivan wealth as an entitlement rather than a responsibility. The ledger was his confession, a roadmap he had left for Martha in case the worst should happen. As she studied the entries, Martha realized the scale of the deceit. David and Sarah had been skimming from the secondary accounts for years. They had used shell companies and fake consulting fees to siphon off hundreds of thousands of dollars while Arthur was still alive, betting on the fact that their father was too preoccupied with his declining health to notice the leaks. But Arthur had noticed. He had documented every unauthorized wire transfer, every suspicious expense report, and every forged signature. He hadn't confronted them, perhaps out of a lingering hope that they would change, or perhaps because he wanted to spare Martha the pain of knowing their children were thieves. Instead, he had restructured the Sullivan Real Estate Trust in a way that David and Sarah had never suspected. The Greenwich Mansion, the crown jewel of the estate, was not actually part of the liquid assets David thought he controlled. According to the trust's secret bylaws, the property was tied to a survival clause. If the house was ever sold against the wishes of the primary occupant, the proceeds would not go to the children. They would be diverted into a charitable foundation managed by a third party. David and Sarah had spent the last 3 months celebrating a $12 million windfall that legally belonged to a non-profit for orphaned children. They were selling a house they didn't truly own, and they were doing it based on a power of attorney that Arthur had secretly revoked in a codicil 3 days before his death. Martha felt a surge of adrenaline that made her fingers tingle. She was not a victim. She was a guardian. The children had treated her like a moocher, a burden to be managed and disposed of, while they were the ones who had been bleeding the family dry for a decade. She thought about David's arrogant smirk and Sarah's jagged laughter on Christmas Eve. They thought they had her trapped in this beige room, waiting for her mind to fail so they could finalize the sale and move on to their next hedonistic venture. They didn't realize that Martha was the only person standing between them and a complete financial collapse. Without her cooperation, and without the documents she now held, the sale of the Greenwich Mansion would trigger a fraud investigation that would put them both in federal prison. On the 5th day of her stay at Evergreen Manor, Martha made her first move. She walked to the payphone in the hallway, avoiding the gaze of the nurses who saw her only as another quiet resident. She dialed a number she had known by heart for 30 years. It was the private line of Robert Vance. Robert had been Arthur's closest friend and his most trusted legal advisor. When Martha had called him 6 months ago about David's requests for more money, Robert had told her to be cautious. He had told her that Arthur had left a fail-safe for her, but he hadn't specified what it was. Now Martha understood. "Robert, it's Martha," she said, her voice low and steady. There was a long silence on the other end, followed by a heavy sigh of relief. "Martha, thank God. I've been trying to reach you. I went to the house, but the security guards David hired wouldn't let me pass the gate. They told me you were away on an extended holiday. I knew David was lying, but I didn't know where he'd taken you." "I am at Evergreen Manor, Robert. They put me in a home on Christmas Eve," she said, her eyes fixed on a water stain on the ceiling. "Those ungrateful bastards," Robert growled, his voice thick with a fury that mirrored her own. "Arthur would burn that house to the ground if he could see what they've done." "Martha, I've been looking into the filings. They've moved for a conservatorship. They're claiming you're incompetent. They're trying to sell the estate to a group called Blue Horizon Investments." "I know," Martha said. "And I have the ledger, Robert. I have the secret trust documents Arthur left in the safe. David and Sarah don't have the legal authority to close that sale. They're committing fraud on a massive scale." "You have the Black Ledger?" Robert's voice dropped to a whisper. "Martha, if you have that book, we have everything. It contains the keys to the offshore accounts and the proof of their embezzlement. Arthur told me that Ledger was your insurance policy. He said you would know when to use it." "I know now," Martha said. "But I don't want to just stop the sale, Robert. I want them to feel the full weight of what they've done. I want them to lose the house, the money, and the arrogance that allowed them to treat their mother like trash. I want to buy the house myself." "You want to buy it?" Robert sounded stunned. "Martha, that would require millions in liquid cash that David and Sarah believe you don't have." "They believe I have nothing because they've been looking at the wrong accounts," Martha said, a cold smile forming on her lips. "They've been looking at the primary Sullivan accounts, the ones they've been skimming from. They don't know about the secondary trust in the Cayman Islands. They don't know about the $12 million Arthur set aside specifically for my protection. I want to use that money to be the Nakdan buyer. I want to be Blue Horizon Investments." Robert let out a sharp, appreciative laugh. "Martha Sullivan, you are your husband's wife. You want to buy your own house from under them using the money they don't even know exists. It's brilliant. It's poetic justice. But we have to be careful. If they suspect it's you, they'll fight the sale out of pure spite." "They won't suspect me," Martha said. "They think I am broken. They think I am sitting in this room, crying over my turkey and waiting to die. I will play the part. I will be the incompetent, grieving mother until the very second the ink is dry on the closing documents. I need you to set up the shell company, Robert. Use a firm in New York. Make the offer through a proxy. Make it look like a corporate acquisition. They're so greedy for that cash that they won't ask questions. They'll be too busy planning their victory parties to look at the fine print." "I can do it," Robert said. "I'll have the paperwork drawn up by the end of the week. But Martha, you have to stay strong. They will likely come to visit you to get your signature on a few more documents to clear the title. You have to make them believe you've given up." "I've spent 40 years making them believe I would do anything for them," Martha said. "Making them believe I was just a mother who didn't understand the world. One more week of acting is a small price to pay for the look on their faces when they realize they've sold their inheritance to the person they tried to destroy." The following days were an exercise in silent, focused endurance. Martha attended the mandatory group therapy sessions at the nursing home, sitting among men and women whose minds were drifting away like autumn leaves. She played the part of the confused widow, her eyes unfocused, her speech hesitant. When the nurses spoke to her, she nodded vaguely, letting them believe that the trauma of the move had accelerated her decline. Inside, however, her mind was a steel trap, calculating the days and the dollars. She watched the clock, counting down the 21 days her children had given her. Each tick of the second hand was a step closer to her return. David and Sarah visited on the 10th day. They arrived together, looking out of place in their designer clothes against the backdrop of the sterile beige hallway. They brought a bouquet of cheap grocery store carnations and a box of chocolates that Martha knew David had likely taken from a gift basket in his office. They sat in her small room, Jessica standing by the door with a look of visible disgust, refusing to touch anything in the room. "How are you settling in, Mum?" Sarah asked, her voice high and fake, as if she were talking to a child or a pet. "The nurses say you've been very quiet. That's good. It means you're adjusting to the routine." Martha looked at her daughter, noticing the new diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. She knew Sarah had bought it with the money she'd taken from Martha's emergency fund. It's very quiet here," Martha said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I miss my roses, Sarah. I miss the kitchen." "The roses were a lot of work, Mum. You shouldn't be worrying about gardening at your age," David said, reaching into his briefcase. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and a gold pen. "Look, we just need you to sign this one last thing. It's a formal waiver for the title insurance. The buyer's legal team found a small discrepancy in the trust filings, and this will clear it up. It's just a formality. It won't change your status here at Evergreen." Martha looked at the paper. It was the final piece of the puzzle. Without her signature on this waiver, the sale to Blue Horizon Investments, her own shell company, could be challenged by any other heirs or creditors. David and Sarah were literally handing her the weapon she would use to finish them. Is it important?" Martha asked, her hand shaking as she reached for the pen. "Very important, Mum. It helps secure your future here," David said, his eyes gleaming with a naked, predatory greed. He watched her hand like a hawk. "Just sign at the bottom, right there." Martha took the pen. She felt the eyes of her son, her daughter, and her daughter-in-law on her. They were holding their breath, their hearts probably racing with the anticipation of the $12 million that was now just a signature away. Martha signed her name, her handwriting intentionally shaky and frail. When she finished, Sarah literally snatched the paper from the table, her face lighting up with a triumphant, ugly joy. "Perfect," Sarah whispered. "Now we can finally move forward." "When can I come home for a visit?" Martha asked, her voice small and pathetic. "Maybe for the new year?" David checked his watch, already mentally halfway to the door. "New Year is going to be very busy for us, Mum. We have a lot of meetings with the new owners and the auction house. Maybe in the spring, okay? We'll call you." They left 5 minutes later. They didn't look back. They didn't see Martha stand up as soon as the door closed, the shaking in her hands disappearing instantly. She walked to the window and watched them get into David's SUV. They were laughing. David slapped Sarah on the back, and Jessica blew a kiss toward the mansion she thought she had successfully stolen. They drove away, convinced they had tricked an old woman into signing away her life. They didn't realize she had just signed their financial death warrants. The second week at Evergreen Manor was the hardest. The psychological toll of living among the dying began to wear on Martha. She saw the way the staff treated the residents, not as people with histories and passions, but as tasks to be completed. She saw the loneliness in the eyes of the man across the hall, whose children hadn't visited him in 3 years. She saw the woman who cried for her mother every night, her memories tangled in a web of shadows. Martha felt a deep, burning anger at a society that allowed the elderly to be tucked away like discarded books. She thought about Arthur, who had always insisted that a person's dignity was their most valuable asset. Her children had tried to strip her of hers, but in doing so, they had given her a new purpose. She was not just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had been told they were a burden. She spent her evenings in the common room, ostensibly watching the news, but actually listening to the conversations of the staff. She learned that David and Sarah had been seen at the mansion multiple times with appraisers and auctioneers. They were selling everything: the antiques, the art collection, even Arthur's personal library. They were treating the house like a carcass, picking it clean before the final sale. This news hurt her more than the nursing home ever could. Those items were not just things. They were the physical manifestations of Arthur's love and hard work. But Martha stayed silent. She held her grief in a cold, hard place in her soul, using it to fuel her resolve. Robert Vance called her every night on the payphone. "The offer has been accepted, Martha." David and Sarah were so eager for the cash that they didn't even try to negotiate. They accepted the first bid. "The closing is set for the 21st day of your stay, January 14th. "And the auction?" Martha asked. "I've had my people look into that as well," Robert said. "The auction is scheduled for the 15th. But here's the catch, Martha. As the new owner of the property through Blue Horizon, you have the right to cancel the auction and reclaim all items on the premises as part of the acquisition. The contract David signed includes all fixtures, furniture, and personal property currently in the mansion. He was so desperate to close the deal that he didn't exclude the contents." Martha felt a small, genuine laugh escape her throat. "He sold his father's library and my wedding china to me. He truly is a fool, Robert." "A fool blinded by greed," Robert agreed. "He thinks he's getting $12 million. He doesn't realize that under the trust's survival clause, the moment the house is sold, the money will be frozen and diverted to the Sullivan Foundation. He'll get nothing, and Sarah will get nothing. They'll be left with the debts they've accumulated and a mountain of legal fees." "I want them to be there for the closing," Martha said. "I want to see their faces when they realize who the Nak Dan buyer is." "They wouldn't miss it for the world," Robert said. "They've planned a party at the mansion for that evening, a New Beginnings gala to celebrate their wealth. They've invited half of New York society." "Then I will attend the party," Martha said. "I will be the guest of honor." As the 21st day approached, Martha felt a shift in the air. The snow in Greenwich began to melt, revealing the dormant, frozen earth beneath. She felt like that earth, quiet, cold, but ready to burst forth with a power that would change the landscape forever. She had spent 21 days in exile. She had lived in a room that smelled of bleach and despair. She had been called a moocher and a burden by the people she had brought into this world. The psychological trauma had left scars, but those scars were like armor now. She was no longer the woman who stood in the kitchen dusting turkey with flour. She was a Sullivan, and a Sullivan always protects the legacy. On the night of the 20th day, Martha packed her few belongings back into the heavy wooden trunk. She didn't have much, just the photos, the black ledger, and her dignity. She sat on the edge of the bed, the sound of the nursing home echoing around her. She thought about the 21 days. In the grand scheme of a 68-year life, 3 weeks was a heartbeat. But in those 3 weeks, her world had been destroyed and rebuilt. She had learned the true nature of her children, and she had discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She had been pushed to the edge of the cliff, and instead of falling, she had learned how to fly. She looked at the small family photo she had kept on her nightstand. It was a picture from 20 years ago, taken in the rose garden. Arthur was laughing. David was a young man with a bright future, and Sarah was a beautiful girl with flowers in her hair. They looked like a perfect family. They looked like people who loved each other. Martha realized that the children in that photo were gone, replaced by the monsters who had put her in this room. The grief she felt for those lost children was real, but it was a quiet, distant thing now. She had mourned them, and now she was ready to face the reality of who they had become. The 21st day arrived with a pale, cold sun. Martha checked out of Evergreen Manor at 9 in the morning. The night nurse looked at her with surprise as Barr stood at the desk, dressed in a sharp, elegant wool coat that Robert Vance had delivered to her the night before. Martha's posture was straight, her gaze steady, and the confusion that had masked her face for 3 weeks was gone. "Are you leaving us, Mrs. Sullivan?" the nurse asked, her voice tinged with a genuine curiosity. "Did your son come to get you?" "No," Martha said, her voice clear and resonant. "I am going home, and I am taking my life back." She stepped out into the crisp morning air, where a black town car was waiting for her. Robert Vance stood by the open door, a wide, triumphant smile on his face. He looked at Martha and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the battle they were about to win. "Everything is ready, Martha," Robert said as she climbed into the back seat. "The closing is at 2 o'clock. The gala is at 7. David and Sarah are already at the mansion, preparing the champagne." "Let them prepare," Martha said, leaning back against the leather seat. "The more expensive the champagne, the more bitter the taste will be when they realize they're drinking to their own downfall." The drive to Greenwich felt different this time. The trees were no longer a blur of dark shadows. They were landmarks on her way back to her kingdom. Martha looked at the black ledger on her lap, the leather cool beneath her fingers. She thought about the 21 days of isolation and the years of subtle gaslighting she had endured. She thought about the word moocher and the look of contempt on Jessica's face. She felt a calm, rational anger that was more powerful than any explosion of rage. She was going to restore the Sullivan name, and she was going to do it with the same meticulous attention to detail that Arthur had used to build it. They arrived at the mansion at 1:45. The Darban sign was still on the lawn, but someone had draped a red velvet ribbon over it in anticipation of the closing. The house looked magnificent in the winter light, its white pillars standing like sentinels against the grey sky. Martha felt a surge of pride. This was her house. This was her history. And in a few hours, it would be hers again, legally and permanently. The closing took place in the library, the very room where Sarah had spilled ink 20 years ago. David and Sarah were there, sitting at the long mahogany table, surrounded by their lawyers and the representatives from Blue Horizon Investments. They looked like they were on top of the world. David was wearing a new gold watch, and Sarah was dripping in silk. Jessica sat in the corner, her eyes darting around the room, already imagining the renovations she would do with her share of the money. They didn't notice Martha and Robert enter the house through the side entrance. They were too focused on the papers in front of them. "We just need the final signatures from the Blue Horizon representative," David's lawyer said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "And then the funds will be released to the escrow account." "I believe I can help with that," Robert Vance's voice rang out as he stepped into the library. David and Sarah looked up, their expressions shifting from irritation to confusion. "Robert, what the hell are you doing here?" David asked, standing up. "This is a private closing. You don't represent the buyer." "Actually, David, I represent the owner of Blue Horizon Investments," Robert said, stepping aside to reveal Martha standing in the doorway. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a world stopping on its axis. David froze, his pen suspended over the final document. Sarah's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Jessica stood up, her face turning a sickly shade of grey. They looked at Martha, and for the first time in their lives, they truly saw her. They saw the woman who had survived their betrayal. They saw the matriarch they had tried to bury, and they saw the power they had never suspected she possessed. Martha walked into the room, her footsteps steady on the hardwood floor. She looked at her children, her gaze devoid of the motherly warmth they had always taken for granted. She looked at the papers on the table, the contracts they had signed, the waivers they had tricked her into signing, the documents of their own greed. 21 yay, Martha said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. You gave me 21 days to find another place. You called me a moocher. You said I was eating your future. Well, David, Sarah, Jessica, the 21 days are up, and I have found my place. She took the gold pen from David's trembling hand and signed the final document with a flourish. She didn't shake. She didn't hesitate. She signed as the owner of Blue Horizon Investments. She signed as the protector of the Sullivan Trust. She signed as the woman who was taking her house back. The closing is complete, Martha said, looking David directly in the eye. Blue Horizon Investments is now the legal owner of this property and all its contents. And as the owner, I have a few announcements to make. And the psychological trauma was still there, a shadow in the corner of her mind, but it was overshadowed by the brilliance of her triumph. She had turned their daggers into her own armor. She had used their greed to fuel her resurrection. The seed of revenge that had been planted in the cold, beige room at Evergreen Manor had grown into a forest of justice. And as the sun began to set over Greenwich, casting long shadows over the Sullivan estate, Martha Sullivan knew that the real gala was just beginning. She stood in her library, the smell of old books and leather familiar and sweet. She looked at her children, who were now just strangers in her house. They were penniless, disgraced, and facing a future that would be defined by the very consequences they had tried to escape. Martha Sullivan was no longer a moocher. She was the mistress of the mansion, and she was home. She walked to the velvet curtains and pulled them back, letting the last rays of the winter sun flood the room. She looked out at the rose garden, dormant but alive beneath the snow. She thought about the 21 days and the lessons she had learned. She thought about Arthur and the legacy they had built. She felt a deep, abiding peace. The battle was won, the debt was paid, and the Sullivan name was finally clean. Martha Sullivan was home, and she was never leaving again. The guests for the gala would be arriving soon. David and Sarah's friends, the elite of New York society, would come expecting a celebration of youth and greed. Instead, they would find a celebration of dignity and justice. Martha looked at Robert Vance and nodded. The countdown was over, the shadow of deceit had been lifted, and in its place was the blinding, beautiful light of the truth. Martha Sullivan was back, and Greenwich would never be the same. The evening air in Greenwich was crisp and smelled of expensive perfume, and the faint, woodsy scent of burning hickory from the mansions nearby. Outside the Sullivan estate, a line of polished black town cars stretched down the long, winding driveway, their headlights cutting through the indigo twilight. David and Sarah had spared no expense for their New Beginnings gala. They had hired the most prestigious catering firm in Manhattan, draped the ballroom in white orchids, and ordered 500 bottles of vintage champagne that cost $1,000 each. To the elite guests stepping through the arched front doors, this was the social event of the season, a celebration of a new era for the Sullivan name. To David and Sarah, it was a victory lap. They stood at the top of the grand staircase, dressed in silk and velvet, looking down at the crowd with a predatory satisfaction. They believed they were $12 million richer. They believed their mother was tucked away in a beige room at Evergreen Manor, a forgotten relic of a past they had successfully liquidated. Jessica moved through the crowd like a queen who had finally secured her throne. She wore a diamond necklace that had once belonged to Martha's grandmother, a piece she had taken from the safe before the appraisers arrived. She sipped her champagne and spoke to the wives of investment bankers, laughing about the upcoming renovations she planned for the mansion. She spoke of marble infinity pools and glass-walled solariums, already erasing every trace of Martha's touch from the colonial walls. David stood nearby, basking in the handshakes of men he had spent his life trying to impress. He felt invincible. He had cleared his debts, secured his future, and silenced the one person who could hold him accountable. He didn't notice the black town car that pulled up to the side entrance, nor did he see Robert Vance step out, followed by a woman whose silhouette was sharp and commanding. Inside the ballroom, the music was a soft, sophisticated jazz that hummed beneath the chatter of 100 voices. David climbed the small podium in front of the fireplace to make his speech. He tapped a crystal glass with a silver spoon, and the room fell into a respectful silence. He cleared his throat, adjusting his gold watch, his face glowing with a pride that was rooted in theft. He thanked everyone for coming to witness the transition of the Sullivan legacy. He spoke of growth and modernization and the necessity of leaving the past behind. He even managed to squeeze out a few fake, sentimental words about his mother, telling the crowd that she was resting comfortably in a private facility where she could get the care her declining mind required. The guests nodded with pity, unaware that the woman he was describing was standing just outside the heavy velvet drapes. "It is time to toast to the future," David announced, raising his glass high. "To the Sullivan name and the prosperity that lies ahead." "I couldn't agree more, David," a voice rang out from the back of the room, cold and resonant as a bell. The crowd parted as if sliced by a blade. Martha Sullivan stepped into the ballroom. She was not the broken, confused woman they had seen on Christmas Eve. She was dressed in a floor-length gown of midnight blue silk, her silver hair styled in an elegant, modern sweep. Around her neck was the Sullivan emerald, a piece so valuable that David hadn't even known it existed in the secret compartment of the safe. Her eyes were sharp and clear, filled with a fire that made the guests catch their breath. Beside her stood Robert Vance, holding a leather briefcase that felt like a weapon. The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. Jessica dropped her glass, the crystal shattering on the marble floor with a sound that felt like the first shot of a war. David's face turned a sickly shade of yellow. He stepped down from the podium, his legs trembling. "Mum, what are you doing here? You should be at Evergreen." "You're confused, Mum. The stress of the sale must have triggered an episode." "The only episode I'm experiencing, David, is a sudden and refreshing clarity," Martha said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. She walked toward the center of the ballroom, her footsteps steady and deliberate. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like the judge and the jury. "I am here because I am the owner of this house. I am here because I am Blue Horizon Investments." Sarah stepped forward, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. "That's impossible. Blue Horizon is a corporate entity. We checked the filings. You're an old woman who can barely manage her own medication. You don't have $12 million, Mum. You have a nursing home bed and a pension." "Actually, Sarah, your mother has exactly what your father intended for her to have," Robert Vance said, stepping forward and opening his briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and laid them on the table in front of the fireplace. Arthur Sullivan was a man who planned for every contingency. He knew David's tech company was a black hole for money, and he knew Sarah's lifestyle was unsustainable. That's why he created the Sullivan Real Estate Trust with a survival clause, a clause that David and Sarah, in their haste to rob their mother, failed to read. Robert looked at the crowd, then back at the siblings, who were now staring at the papers as if they were venomous snakes. The clause states that if the Greenwich mansion is ever sold against the written consent of Martha Sullivan, or if she is removed from the property under false pretenses, the entirety of the sale proceeds is automatically diverted. David, the $12 million you thought you were getting tonight? It has already been transferred to the Sullivan Foundation for Orphaned Children. You haven't earned a cent. You've merely become the world's most expensive real estate agents for a charity. A gasp rippled through the ballroom. The socialites and bankers looked at David and Sarah with a new kind of interest, the kind people reserved for a spectacular car crash. Jessica lunged toward the table, her hands clawing at the documents. That can't be true. We had the power of attorney. We had the conservatorship. The power of attorney was revoked 3 days before Arthur died, Jessica, Martha said, her voice like ice. I have the codicil. And as for the conservatorship, it was granted based on the incidents you fabricated. Robert and I have spent the last 21 days gathering affidavits from the house staff and the independent doctors who examined me at Evergreen. We have the recordings of you discussing the stove incident as a way to trick the judge. The conservatorship was vacated by a court order 3 hours ago. You are not my guardians. You are just trespassers in my home. David grabbed the edge of the fireplace, his knuckles white. Mum, please. We were just trying to protect the family assets. We were worried about you. You weren't worried about me, David. You were worried about your liquidity, Martha said. She reached into her handbag and pulled out the small black ledger. You should have looked for this before you packed my trunk. Your father kept a very detailed record of the $300,000 you siphoned from the secondary accounts over the last 3 years. He recorded every shell company, every fake invoice, and every forged signature. I have the bank trails, David. I have the proof of embezzlement that would put you in a federal prison for 20 years. She turned her gaze to Sarah, whose diamond bracelet seemed to dull under Martha's stare. And I have the records of the $400,000 Sarah took from the trust to pay off her credit cards and her divorce lawyers. You didn't just try to sell my house. You've been robbing your father's legacy for years while calling me a burden. You called me a moocher, Jessica. But look around this room. Look at the flowers and the champagne and the silk. Everything here was bought with stolen money. You are the moochers. You are the ones who've been eating the future while I kept the lights on. The guests were now whispering loudly, their cameras out, capturing the humiliation of the Sullivan heirs. Sarah began to sob, a jagged, ugly sound that lacked any real remorse. Jessica looked at David, but found only a man who was hollow and defeated. David looked at Martha, and for the first time in his life, he saw the person who had actually held the family together. He saw the strength he had mistaken for weakness, and the intelligence he had mistaken for obsolescence. The closing of the sale to Blue Horizon is final, Martha announced, her voice rising in power. I am the legal owner of this house and everything in it. And as the owner, I find this party to be in poor taste. Robert, please call the security team. Within minutes, the same security guards David had hired to keep Martha out were now escorting the guests to the door. The ballroom emptied with a frantic, embarrassed speed, the white orchids and vintage champagne left behind like the debris of a shipwreck. Only David, Sarah, and Jessica remained, standing in the middle of the vast, echoing room. What now, Mum? David whispered, his voice small and broken. What are you going to do to us? I am going to do exactly what you did to me, Martha said. She gestured to the hallway where their luggage had already been placed by Robert's team. You have 1 hour to pack whatever you brought with you tonight. You will leave this house, and you will not return. Your accounts are frozen. Your credit cards have been cancelled. The cars you drove here are registered to the trust, and the keys are already on my desk. You are leaving exactly as you tried to send me to Evergreen, with nothing but a trunk and a memory of a life you didn't earn. You can't do this, Martha. We're family, Jessica shrieked, her face twisted in a mask of desperation. Family is a bond of trust, Jessica. You broke that bond on Christmas Eve, Martha said. You said I was a financial burden. Well, now you are your own burden. David, Sarah, I gave you 40 years of my life. I gave you every opportunity and every cent I could spare. You chose to trade that love for $12 million that isn't yours. Go live the lives you've built for yourselves. Go see what the real world looks like without a moocher to pay your bills. Martha stood by this grand staircase as her children dragged their suitcases out of the front door. David didn't look at her. Sarah wouldn't stop crying. Jessica was already on her phone, likely trying to find a friend who would take her in. But Martha knew that in Greenwich, people like the Sullivans didn't have friends once the money was gone. They stepped out into the cold January night, the heavy mahogany door clicking shut behind them with a finality that felt like a heartbeat. The house was silent again. Martha stood in the foyer, the emerald around her neck glowing in the dim light. She looked at the scratch on the floor and the stain on the rug. She looked at the portraits of her children that she would soon move to the attic. She felt a deep, profound sadness, but she also felt a peace that was solid and unshakable. She had taken her house back, but more importantly, she had taken her dignity back. She was no longer the woman who lived for the validation of children who didn't love her. She was Martha Sullivan, a woman who had survived the fire and come out as gold. She walked into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. She thought about the turkey and the rosemary and the sage. She thought about Evergreen Manor and the 21 days of isolation. She realized that the betrayal had been a gift, a terrible and necessary surgery that had removed the rot from her life. She was alone, but she was not lonely. She had Robert Vance, she had the Sullivan Foundation, and she had the memory of Arthur, whose love had reached out from the grave to save her. As the first light of dawn began to touch the Greenwich skyline, Martha Sullivan walked out onto the terrace. She looked at the snow melting on the rose garden, the earth beneath it waiting for the spring. She thought about the people she would help with the $12 million, the children who would have a future because her own children had been so greedy. She felt a quiet, powerful joy. The Sullivan legacy was no longer about marble floors and gold watches. It was about justice. It was about character. It was about a mother who refused to be forgotten. Martha closed her eyes and took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. She was home. She was free. And she was ready for the spring. The Sullivan mansion stood tall and proud in the morning light, a house no longer haunted by the ghosts of greed, but filled with the dignity of a woman who had finally learned her own worth. Justice is not merely about the recovery of property or the balance of a bank account, but about the restoration of a soul that was once discarded. The betrayal of a child is a wound that never truly closes, but it can be transformed into a source of wisdom and unbreakable strength. To be called a moocher by those you have nurtured is a cruelty that reveals their poverty of spirit, not yours. True dignity exists in the ability to stand tall when the world expects you to crawl, and true family is built on respect, not on the anticipation of an inheritance. Forgiveness is a path for the self, but justice is a requirement for the truth to survive. Redemption only begins when the consequences of one's actions finally come home to stay.